Hello there and welcome to the third episode of this kind, the third episode of Financial Deceptions series in which I try to touch upon certain financial information that, unless someone understands them a bit better, could be misleading. And in this case, I want to touch upon restructuring expense, but what you'll see in this video is applicable for all the other kinds of expenses that are one-time or non-recurring in nature. If we take a look at the definition, restructuring expense is defined as the cost a company incurs during corporate restructuring. They are considered non-recurring operating expenses, and if a company is undergoing restructuring, they show up as a line item on the income statement. So every company, once it goes through such an event, of course, they disclose that expense separately. But if you're looking at a company, if you're analyzing, basically what you're expecting is, well, they incur these expenses now, and that period could be 1 or 2 financial years, but you would not expect that that happens, for example, 1 year later, right? So they're non-recurring in nature, and you would expect that once a company does this restructuring, then they're good to go and they can continue operating. Maybe sometime later in a decade it have that again, but it should not be every year, right? Well, that is basically based on the definition, right? But there is no rule that it cannot be. So let's take a look at Coca-Cola. It's a giant company, 44 billion in revenue. If we take a look at, and I'm using ticker, and you'll see this with any third-party financial data aggregator. If you take a look at the way it's structured, starts with revenue, gross profit, operating expenses. Then at some point it says excluding unusual items, right? And you can grab this and you can see all kinds of stuff. But if we take a look at this unusual stuff, what is below that are these unusual stuff, right? Unusual items. And one of them is merger and restructuring charges. And this is basically what was in the definition. So this is something that should not be recurring, right? So let's take a look at that, right? So this is for the last 12 months, right? Let's take a look at 2021. Wait a second. Wait, they have again and again and again. Wait, I'm going back a decade. Between 2013, 2022, so a whole decade, they had every single year an expense related to merger and restructuring charges. So the definition is not applicable here. It's not a non-recurring expense. And if you're using the operating income and these margins as a basis for your valuation, basically you're missing, and this is about 2% of revenue. So you're adding artificially 2% to their margin. And of course, that would lead to a higher valuation than it is fair. So only because something based on the definition is one-time or non-recurring doesn't mean that in reality it is. So if you see something that sounds as if it is one-time, make sure that it is one-time. So if Coca-Cola had this, for example, only over the last 2 years, and then looking back for a decade, there was nothing, I would say, okay, well, they've done it once, and I would not forecast that in the next year or the next 5 years. But in this case, if I do not include it in my assumptions, I would be missing a significant expense. And don't get me wrong, it's not that Coca-Cola does something shady. They're an extremely large company. They have physical presence in geographically all over the world. Therefore, it could be that these merger and restructuring charges are occurring at different times in different parts of the world, and they are allowed to do that. But it doesn't fit within the definition that these are non-recurring. And it's not just this, it can be any expense that in nature it sounds as it is one time, but in reality isn't. So do not trust these definitions. Instead, take a look at the financials and you'll find more information there than just by accepting the definition and ignoring because they're one time. So only because it is one time by definition, it doesn't mean that it is. That would be all regarding this video. I hope that you enjoyed it. And as always, I'll see you in the next one.